The Strait of Hormuz as a lever of power rather than a revenue stream. The question whether Iran charges money for ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz is not fundamentally about fees or tariffs, it is about power asymmetry embedded in geography. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow maritime corridor connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the wider Indian Ocean. It represents one of the most strategically constrained choke points in the global energy system. Roughly one-fifth of the world's traded oil transits this passage, making it less a neutral shipping lane, more a structural vulnerability in the architecture of global trade. In such a system, the actor controlling one side of the choke point, particularly Iran, doesn't need to formally charge tolls to extract value. Control itself is the currency. Any attempt to impose explicit charges must be understood not as a commercial policy but as a coercive instrument within a broader geopolitical strategy. Legal architecture, transit passage, and its limits. Under the framework of United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the Strait of Hormuz falls under the regime of transit passage, a legal concept designed to ensure uninterrupted navigation through the straits used for international shipping. This doctrine constrains coastal states, including Iran, from arbitrarily impeding passage or imposing general transit tolls. The rationale is systemic stability. Global trade cannot function if choke points become rent extraction nodes for regional powers. However, the law enforcement mechanism is weak. UNCLOS relies on compliance, not coercion. Iran itself has a complex relationship with the convention, having signed but not fully ratified it, which creates ambiguity that can be exploited. This legal ambiguity is the first structural failure point. It allows a state actor to test boundaries without immediately triggering enforceable consequences, especially when enforcement would require military escalation by external powers. Historical pattern from harassment to conditional control. Iran has historically avoided overtly charging transit fees because doing so would trigger immediate international backlash and potentially justify military intervention. Instead, it has employed indirect methods of extraction. These include harassment of vessels, temporary seizures, forced inspections, and the creation of a risk premium that elevates shipping insurance costs. The economic burden is thus externalized. Instead of a formal toll, the system imposes a shadow tax on global trade through uncertainty. This method is more efficient than a strategic perspective. It preserves plausible deniability while still monetizing control. The absence of formal toll is not a sign of restraint, it is a sign of strategic optimization. Direct tolls are visible and contestable. Indirect coercion is diffuse and harder to counter. The 2026 escalation, transit from implicit to explicit extraction. Recent developments indicate a shift in Iranian strategy towards more explicit monetization efforts. Reports of parliamentary approval for transit fees and anecdotal evidence of vessels paying substantial sums for safe passage suggest a transition from implicit coercion to explicit rent-seeking. This is not a legal evolution, it is a tactical escalation driven by economic pressure and geopolitical isolation. Iran faces sanctions, constrained export capacity, and fiscal stress. In such a context, converting geographic leverage into direct revenue becomes an attractive, albeit risky option. However, this move exposes a critical miscalculation risks. Explicit tolls transform a gray zone tactic into a clear violation of international norms, increasing the probability of coordinated retaliation by naval powers, such as the United States or coalitions involving European and Asian energy importers. Economic mechanics. Why a toll system is structurally fragile. A formal toll system in the Strait of Hormuz could not function like a conventional canal fee, such as those imposed in the Suez Canal or Panama Canal. Those systems operate under internationally recognized governance structures with predictable pricing and guaranteed passage. Hormuz, by contrast, is embedded in a contested security environment. Any attempt to charge tolls introduces volatility into pricing mechanisms. Shipping companies would respond by rerouting where possible, increasing reliance on pipelines that bypass the strait, or demanding naval escorts. Insurance premiums would spike, eroding the net revenue Iran seeks to capture. In equilibrium, the state becomes self-defeating. The more aggressive Iran attempts to extract tolls, the more incentive other actors have to invest in alternatives, thereby reducing the long-term strategic value of the strait itself. Strategic calculus, deterrence credibility, and escalation risk. From a strategic standpoint, the imposition of transit fee is not about revenue maximization, but about signaling resolve and testing the limits of deterrence. Iran's objective is to demonstrate that it can disrupt global energy flows at will. Charging fees is a secondary effect. The primary effect is psychological, forcing global markets to internalize the risk of disruption. However, this strategy has a narrow operating window. If Iran pushes too far, it risks triggering a hard response, including naval blockades, targeting strikes, or multinational petrol regimes that neutralize its leverages. The Strait of Hormuz is not under unilateral control. It is a contested space with significant US Fifth Fleet presence and allied naval capabilities. The moment Iran converts latent power into overt extraction, it invites counterpower. Second-order effects, market distortions, and strategic realignments. The imposition or even the credible threat of tolls in Hormuz generates second-order effects across global markets. Oil prices become more volatile, not necessarily because supply is immediately constrained, but because risk premium increases. Import-dependent economies such as India, China, Japan, and members of the European Union must adjust procurement strategies, often accelerating diversification into alternative suppliers or energy sources. This in turn affects long-term demand pattern. Infrastructure investments shift towards pipeline by bypassing Hormuz, such as those in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Over time, these adjustments erode Iran's leverage. The more aggressively Iran uses the strait as a weapon, the more the global system adapts to neutralize that weapon. Third-order effects, institutional erosion and precedent risk. If Iran were to successfully normalize toll collection in Hormuz without significant pushback, the president would exit beyond the region. Other states controlling choke points would attempt similar strategies, leading to a fragmentation of the global maritime regime. The principle of free navigation would weaken and shipping lanes could become subjects of localized rent extraction. This would increase transaction costs across the entire economy, reduce trade efficiency, and potentially trigger competing militarizations of strategic waterways. The systematic consequence is a shift from rule-based maritime governance to power-based control. This is regression to a pre-modern trade dynamics where force, not law, determines access. Failure points in Iran's approach. The primary failure point in Iran's strategy is overextension. Attempting to convert strategic leverage into a direct revenue accelerates countermeasures that would otherwise remain latent. The second failure point is misjudging coalition dynamics, where individual states may tolerate low-level harassment. Explicit tolls create a shared grievance that can unify disparate actors into a coordinated response. The third failure point is economic short-sightedness. Short-term revenue gains from tolls are likely to be offset by long-term losses in strategic relevance as alternative routes and energy transitions reduce dependence on the strait. Outcome projection: if the current behavior persists, if Iran continues to push towards formalized toll collection, the most probable outcome is escalation followed by containment. Naval powers will increase their presence, establish escort systems, and potentially impose countermeasures that limit Iran's ability to interfere with shipping. The strait will become more militarized, not more profitable. Iran may extract episodic payments under conditions of high-end tensions, but it will not establish a stable toll regime compared to major canals. Instead, it will trade long-term strategic leverage for short-term unsustainable revenue streams. The net result is a degradation of its bargaining position over time. Final assessment: control without stability is self-defeating. The Strait of Hormuz provides Iran with structural power, but that power is contingent on restraint. The moment it is aggressively monetized, it triggers countervailing forces that diminish its value. Iran doesn't need to charge tolls to extract benefits. Its geographic positioning already imposes a global risk premium. The attempt to formalize that premium into a direct fee is not a sign of strength, but of constrained options. If it reflects economic pressure than strategic dominance, in a system governed by both law and force, overt extraction invites force. The equilibrium that maximizes Iran's leverage is one of the controlled instability, not explicit taxation.